Welcome to another AIA Illinois virtual tour. My name is Mike Jackson. I'm an architect in Springfield, and today we're in downtown Champaign, Illinois to see the studio and loft of architect Jack Sherman Baker. It's a space that I'm familiar with because it tells a story of architecture in the modern sense, but also this is a pioneering example of adaptive use. Jack Sherman Baker was an architect on the faculty at the University of Illinois. He practiced in the city as well, and during his career, he built some 20 buildings around central Illinois in a modernist style. But one of his signature projects is his studio and loft, where in 1950, his family had a business, and he basically used to come upstairs to the office upstairs. When the opportunity presented itself in 1957, he bought this building and he started a project to transform it into his work and living space. In doing so, he created one of the first loft apartments in America. The spaces itself will tell the story. We'll walk around and show you what he did, but the idea that he did this is just amazing to me because this is before the loft movement in New York City. He is looking at this as raw warehouse space and reimagining it, and he does it extremely well. So let's talk about the space. When he started, this was raw warehouse. There was a lift to get equipment and storage stuff up here, but it was basically bare brick walls, open floor joists and ceiling joists, and just an open, basically strip flooring, not hardwood finish flooring, just open flooring, wood. He saw this palette of materials as the background to creating a new way of thinking about living spaces. So he exploits the character of the existing materials. The brick walls, he paints them white to make it more spacious. The ceiling above, he paints it all white to let more light. He cuts in strategic skylights to let more light come in from down. And all of a sudden, he puts in a big window at the back on the south so the light is streaming in. So now he's got one large volume, about 20 feet by 60 feet, that becomes a living space. And he then details this with precision, adding new elements where needed discreetly, closets, bedrooms, and storage spaces. But this idea of the large open space, exploiting the raw character of the original materials, but giving them a finish that amplifies them. The brick is painted white. It leaves the texture and it lets it show as what it is, but it gives it more brightness and lightness. And he liked that in his spaces. He was informed by an interest in a variety of things architecturally, but he was also informed by his love of dance. And he talks about architecture as a performance space. And later when he renovates this building, which like most architects, he took a career to renovate his own house. So he starts in 1960. By 1963, he's got his studio and loft created. In 63 and 4, he creates another apartment space. And in the early 70s, creates a dance and performance loft space. We're going to tour all of these today. So the story is one of transformation, but doing so with an exquisite modernist aesthetic overlaid with traditional and old materials. And in doing this space inside, upstairs, downtown, he also explored the outside around him. There are two exquisite outdoor courtyards that he created. They're enclosed with high walls and finished with almost a Japanese Zen aesthetic. A gravel surface, carefully placed objects, so you come in from the outside, but the outside and the inside are separated with huge glass windows so that they all connect to each other. There's a performance space that ties in to the outdoor courtyard on the east side of the building, and the south side he had a working studio on the lower part of the building that tied into the outside courtyard. He planted the first street trees in downtown Champaign in the 1960s, and he talks about the city going, we've not done that before. So he gets how landscape plays in, but he does it again with this exquisite level of detailing and precision. So the outdoor spaces complement the indoor spaces in being open and wide. One of the things about these spaces and the way he enclosed them, though, that I find kind of interesting and quirky about him is that he didn't like to hang things on the walls. The walls and surfaces are to be kept open and emphasize them as space informing, but not to be cluttered with stuff. So when you look around in his office, you'll see all the awards that he got sitting on the floor around the office floor because he couldn't stand putting them on the walls. We'll give him that little interesting idea of his because it's a way he felt the architecture had to express himself. Another exquisite part of his work is the detailing. Jack was very much an architect in the modernist era, where smooth planar surfaces contrast with the older elements and the textures, and whenever he could do detailing, it wasn't clunky. It wasn't clunky. Things were done precisely with little reveals, little edges, huge flowing doors, but all of this with a minimalist design aesthetic that plays off the contrast of traditional materials. He took this even so far that one unique aspect of the design, that is that in the design of his kitchen, he did it so that he could fold over a cover to cover over the whole the kitchen preparation area. The kitchen stove and the sink and the refrigerator are all enclosed with this smooth, long, mahogany planar surface so that when he's had parties or receptions, that didn't clutter up the space. So he's learning how to live in a space and have it both be precise and be open for events, but when he needs to then wash the dishes, he can just, open things up and it works like a regular kitchen. He thought through these details with incredible precision. One of the first things he did when he moved up here was to create his office. There was an office upstairs. It was a fairly small space at the front, and that becomes the ground zero to this whole space that he does. The office space now, he changed the windows, made them huge and large with thin metal mullions, letting in the glass on the light, north light. Then he puts a huge wall of shelves for the bookcases, and the books are going to fill it up. The brick wall on one side, and then lays out his layout tables and workspace within that. So that's how he gets started. He had some other people working with him from time to time, but he begins at the front of the building, which is kind of the third of the front, second floor. The back 2/3 is the big space we're in now, which is the loft living space. The upper floor of the building, though, has actually got three major components to it. His office, the loft, and then a second space to the east, which you go through the brick wall, and there he created more traditional bedrooms and bathrooms, closets, and in 1970s, early 70s, he creates an artistic performance space, tying in with the dance. One of the unique aspects of that is there was an old hoist elevator there. Literally, you pulled the rope, the elevator brought you stuff up, they stored stuff up here. What Jack did is to take that elevator way, sunk it to make sort of a sunken living room conversation pit, and then he takes the platform and elevates it where it becomes kind of a dancer's display platform, and then he's got the outdoor terrace and the big space as a performance space. So dancers would come, performances would happen. This was a very lively, active place when Jack lived here. Frequent parties and events going on. So you're just thinking about all the things he's done. An office, a loft living space, a sort of more private bedroom, and then a dance performance loft. And that's in the parts that he lived in and occupied. Another part of this project is at the back of the building, on both the first and the second floor. He created a smaller working studio for himself, which he liked to do because he could sit there and look at the outside courtyard. And he created a separate one-bedroom apartment that has a wonderful two-story space. The spiral staircase goes up, a bedroom loft up above, and a wonderful small by square foot standards, but spectacularly beautiful guest apartment, which he rented out as part of his real estate development here. Just to be fair to the whole story, there are two rental office spaces at the front of the building. One's got a beauty salon in it now, which he actually renovated in the early 1980s. But those spaces were fairly plain and he didn't do much with them. The real story of this place is what he does upstairs with his loft conversion. And it's a very wonderful complex of office living spaces, performance spaces, and secondary apartment spaces, all done with this same wonderful aesthetic. In addition to his interest in modern architecture and design, one of the things that Jack does is he furnishes this house with signature pieces of modernist furniture designed by architects from the 1920s through the 1960s. Chairs by Marcel Breuer, the chaise lounge by Le Corbusier, chairs by Eames. So the signature story of modern furniture fits within his modernist aesthetic and era of the 1960s. So all these furnishings are still part of the story of what this place does and how it works together. We've talked about the story of what Jack designed and did and how he came to this. But the mystery of all this is, why did he do it? Why did he decide, as a young architect, wanting to make his own statement of how he wants to live with his house, why did he decide to convert a loft on the upper floor of this old building downtown? Was it the opportunity of the space that he knew? We don't know an answer from him, but what we do know is that he was ahead of the curve. The New York City loft movement starts after this. While there were artists working in old lofts as studio spaces, they weren't living there, and they certainly weren't creating designed environments with this loft aesthetic. What Jack did was a pioneering example. Now, New York legalized artists living in the Soho area in the 1960s, 64 and 68, and after that, the artist loft movement starts to take over, and by the 70s and 80s, it moves from just being artists to everybody. Today, across the world, the loft movement is popular as a way to make urban living spaces out of our spaces from our ancestors. Jack is a pioneer in showing us how to do that. With exquisite detailing, emphasizing the original character and complementing it, he is ahead of the curve in showing us how to make old buildings live again. And that's a legacy that's part of his enduring legacy. He's a modernist architect, but he had several commissions where he showed modernism and old buildings can go together, and he did it extremely well. Jack grew up in Champaign. This was his family home. It's known that when he had his office here, he sometimes was living back at home with his mother, going back and forth. And one of the wonderful things I love about what he did and the way he furnished this place are the modernist design materials, but he also has a few sacred family artifacts. One of the most noteworthy of these is a player organ. It looks like something from the 1880s, from the high Victorian era, and it sits here in wonderful design contrast to the open plan and the planar surfaces of his spaces. And I think this shows it's almost like a curated object. He knows how to look at things, give them a setting where they just look perfect against a background. So he's almost a curator of his home life. And that little artifact says that, but it also says I'm part of this family and connecting it over time. These are all the signs of a great architect with good creativity and how to put this together. In our tour of the Jack Baker studio and loft, we've looked at the upstairs. Now we're going to come downstairs and look at two unique spaces he created. On the rear, at the back of the building, he created a guest apartment. And in this space, he did a couple of things differently. First of all, he cuts a big opening in the ceiling of the second floor to create a large two-story volume space, puts this beautiful dynamic spiral staircase that goes up through it, giving this energy. And instead of being all white, he moves to a black and white formula. The floor is painted black, the ceiling structure that's exposed is painted black, so there's kind of like these parallel lines of darkness with the lightness in between. At the back of this room, he's created big open spaces of windows that lets in lots of natural light from the south, and it looks out to the courtyard. So while this is actually a fairly small little one-bedroom loft apartment, meaning the bedroom is in a sleeping loft up above, it's got a huge amount of spatial feel to it, with almost 30 feet, I think, from the first floor to the second floor of the top height of this space. It's otherwise resolutely detailed, just like his other parts of this building. Planar surfaces, smooth kitchen countertop, kind of that's sort of hidden away, little dining area, living room niche, and sleeping loft. So a very wonderful small-scale apartment that he kept as a guest residence and was rented all the time, including several other faculty members from the School of Architecture who lived here for years at a time. Now we've moved from the second floor to the rear studio on the first floor. This was a secondary small-scale apartment for guests to come and stay in. It's got an interesting kitchen and bath, and it's all set up for small guests. But it's sitting on the first floor looking out to the rear courtyard, and it has a wonderful light about it as a working space. In fact, Jack liked to come down here a lot and work on his drawings. But he was more playful with this space in some ways than the other parts of this design. Here, he's made this wonderful big arch behind me in the wall. He's got an architectural fragment hanging from there. And like the other studio he did on the first floor, or the apartment he did, it's planar surfaces, white painted brick walls, black surfaces below and above. So you've got this kind of white lighted walls in between dark surfaces. But the playfulness of this space just grabs you. When you come in, a big circular arch in the wall, you look through to the space behind, and this architectural fragment hanging overhead. It's one of my favorite spaces in the complex he did because of that playfulness. He's sort of ahead of the curve when it comes to the postmodern movement with that architectural fragment and using that. In this other space, he's also used some features like a stained glass window that he got from a church. So he was able to be playful with pieces and use them strategically like that. Just again, another way that his creativity was allowed to come through, old and new, but mostly looking new, but still using the old. A good designer who pulls that off. When we talk about this place, I can describe it and give you a great sense of the design and the quality of it. But one of the questions that always comes up is, why did Jack choose to renovate an old building for his personal living instead of designing a new building, which at the time period in 1960 would have been the most common thing to do? So in this, we're not guided by any specific words from him. He didn't leave us any messages about that. We do know that he had the opportunity to rent this space. He was familiar with it. He started setting up his office upstairs, and I'm hoping that that just led him to think, this is a wonderful space, I'm going to take this leap. But in doing so, he is way ahead of the curve. The loft movement in New York City did not get started until the 1960s when it became legal to live in lofts. So Jack is ahead of that. And the loft movement goes on after 1968 to basically become an international movement of design. There's loft apartments in New York and Chicago and Montreal and Toronto and New Orleans and London. There's a loft magazine out of London that talks about loft living. So this style of living has taken off as a modern way to live, and Jack is a pioneer of looking at how to do that. I think it's an enduring part of his legacy that will be one of the most important things that he does in his career is try this out before anyone else did it. So is this the first loft in America? No, that's impossible to ever sort of determine. I'm sure there were people living upstairs downtown before that in open spaces. But in terms of a design aesthetic, a modernist intervention in an old space, this is certainly one of the first documented ones I'm aware of. And that's part of the legacy of Jack Sherman Baker. We're at the Erlanger House, a house designed in 1964 by architect Jack Baker for Margaret Erlanger. She was the head of the dance department at the University of Illinois. And here Jack, an enthusiast for dance, had the right client and an amazing commission to create a house for a lover of dance. I'm standing in the main performance house of the space. This huge thing behind me, sort of a big fireplace, a centerpiece. I look off to a large open courtyard to the back that's got an enclosed courtyard to it. There's also an interior courtyard, so we've got outdoor spaces, indoor spaces, and a big performance space in the middle. As with other works of Jack, he likes to explore the perfect parallel lines of a smooth, planar brick wall. In this case, he uses a natural kind of pink toned brick, similar to Chicago common brick, and he creates this very geometrically rigid square space, opens it up with light, balconies, etc., to make this a grand performance hall. It's actually a fairly small house with large volumes. There's just really one sleeping area up above, a little niche bathroom, a small kitchen behind. So it's not really a large house, but it's perfect for a single person or a couple and perfect for entertaining. There's records of dance events over the years happening here. And now, today, this house is owned by the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois, and it's used for guest housing. So many famous architects who visited and toured and lectured at the school have stayed here over the years. So it's a story that continues, a house that lives on with a special purpose, but gives you that sense of the perfect geometry that Jack liked to explore in the designs that he did. The house is set on an urban lot facing a park, but unlike most houses that might have a big porch facing that, here the house is very discreet from the street. You come up, there's a little inlet on the side of the house for the door, and the main mass of the house facing the street is blank. But that blankness hides an interior courtyard that then is the backdrop to this main space. So he really plays with geometry and space and enclosing. So even though you're in a very public setting, it's a very private house when you're in it. Another hallmark of Jack's work is his precision of detailing. There's a very delicate handrail on the whole system of stairs that leads you up to the second floor, a thin little profile on the balcony, and with everything else, smooth planar surfaces, a kitchen that's just one uniform plane, everything efficiently designed. There's one piece of glass in this house. It must be 4 feet wide and 20 feet high, set into brick moldings, just precise as can be. So Jack really knew how to detail things in a modernist aesthetic that just took everything to the dimensions of precision, much as Mies van der Rohe would have done. So while he's working in a more vernacular way of using masonry. He does it with a very modern touch with the details. So this is all the marks of a great architect. Knows how to take new materials and old materials and create a sense of space that really plays to the poetry of dance. And that's what his client wanted, and he achieved it very well. The client, Margaret Erlinger, was very gracious. In her estate, when she died, she donated the house to the University of Illinois. And today it resides as a place of residence for visiting faculty, primarily through the School of Architecture, but also available to other program areas.